Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Imagine I could make you this offer, that you could become whatever you want, rich, powerful, athletic, famous, all four, Nobel Prize-winning novelist, whatever. On one condition, just one condition, there's always a catch. The condition is forgetting what you have been as if you had been born all over again. Leibniz said, suppose that someone could suddenly become king of China, this being the most wonderful thing that could be imagined in his time, but only on condition of forgetting what he had been as if he had just been born all over again. Would it not, in practice or in terms of perceivable effects, be the same as if he had been annihilated and a king of China had been created at the same instant in his place? And that is something which that individual could have no reason to want. Now, this isn't an argument. At this stage, I'm not really presenting arguments. I'm just trying to present something, make plausible what I think is a really strong intuition. Basically, if you forget everything as if you were born anew, that's like you've died, right? So we all have this sense that being who we are is in some important way dependent upon the continuity of our mental lives, memories, but other things as well. John Locke said, let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial spirit, which is that which thinks in him, and in the constant change of body keeps him the same, and is that which he calls him himself. So imagine we have this immortal soul. Let him also suppose it to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy, which it may have been. But now, having no consciousness of any of these actions, does or can he conceive himself to be the same person with either of them? Can he be concerned in either of their actions, attribute them to himself, or think them his own, more than the actions of any other men that ever existed? Rhetorical questions. The answer is clearly no. And again, this isn't an argument, actually. All John Locke is doing here is eliciting intuitions from us. The intuition he's eliciting is that even if we did have the same immaterial, immortal soul as someone else, in the absence of any psychological connection, that wouldn't make us the same person. In the same kind of way that, if you have a transplanted organ, if you have someone else's heart, someone else's liver, someone else's eyes, you don't become that person in virtue of having a bit of them. The Leibniz point about, king of China was that to be the same person as someone else, it's not sufficient to have the same biological body. No biological animal dies in hypothetical possibility, but the mental content has completely changed. So it's not a question of the same physical stuff. And in the Locke case, he's saying it wouldn't be the same as any immaterial stuff. So in a sense, we don't have to think about whether souls exist or not. The point is whether they exist or not. Having the same soul wouldn't make you the same person. What the intuition both of them are really eliciting from us is this very strong one that being the same person definitely requires continuity of mental life. It's not about the substance at all. Now here I think is the common sense view. The common sense view is there is you, right? You exist, and you have certain things. You have memories, you have desires, you have beliefs. In this case, the personalized number plate, I don't know whether it indicates the person believes they are the Messiah or simply that they believe in the Messiah. But anyway, you have your beliefs and you have knowledge. You can recite quotes from Spinoza. So this is a common sense view. If you think about, I talk about our mental life being what makes us, but the common sense view I think is that there is an I, there is a me, which has these things. But the suggestion that articulated in the book is that this isn't true, right? It's not that there is a you that has these things, rather there are thoughts, beliefs, desires, intentions, and so forth. These things are very closely interrelated and connected with one another. And it's in virtue of that that you exist. Okay. Now, this is a subtle, in some ways, and huge in other ways, shift in understanding of ourselves. For most people, the assumption they have is that they have a kind of essence or core. Whether they believe that's an immaterial soul or something more ephemeral or brain, whatever it might be, people believe there is some essence of them there is an I which pops into existence whenever it is, birth, conception, whatever it might be. It continues to exist as a constant, singular entity until death, or perhaps it carries on afterwards. But whatever, there is an I, there is some essence, core of self. And it's this self which has all these experiences. But if you shift it around and say, well, no, there is no core essence of self. There is just all the experiences, all these things that, Leibniz, Locke, arguing that it's the mental life which makes us who we are. The argument here is that the mental life is really just this very organized and related connection of thoughts and collection, of thoughts and ideas. And it's all those together which make you you. There is no core at the heart of it. It sounds weird, it sounds wrong, it just seems to be counter to all experience. But the question I've got is, why is that? Because think of pretty much everything else in the universe, apart from perhaps fundamental particles, isn't it exactly the same? Here we go, water is H2O, we know that. Okay, you learn that very basic chemistry. When you've got the 2 hydrogen and the 1 oxygen, and they're related, they're connected in the right way, you've got the water. That's the same for the self. That's basically the same model for the self. It's the same for anything. So in a way, it's surprising that it should be surprising to suggest that there is no core or pearl of self, that we are just the collection of our psychological attributes, memories, and so forth. So I think this is a very sensible idea. It's an idea which has a tremendous heritage, actually. It's not, as I said, it wasn't new. One of the earliest versions of it goes back to the Buddha. The Buddha taught, the Buddhist teaching of anatta is translated often as a no self or not self view. It is strikingly like contemporary versions of it. The idea is essentially, again, that there is no abiding permanent self at the core of being. We are simply the aggregates, the elements of mental life in collection and so forth. And part of the point of doing various forms of meditative practice is to become aware of that through increased self-awareness. So through meditative practice, you become aware that actually that's true. There is no thing at the heart of self. You become aware of the nothingness at the heart of existence. Very strikingly similar view, developed perhaps most fully with David Hume. The connection between Hume and Buddhism is an interesting one, because it's perhaps not an obvious one, because people don't think of European Enlightenment rational thinking as being on the same wavelength as Buddhist sort of transcendental tradition. But I think that partly is just the case that we stereotype both and don't recognize there's a very strong rational tradition in Buddhism. And also, one of those striking passages in Hume about this is actually when he invites us to introspect, ineffectively, to discover this. In discussing the proposition put over by people like Descartes that the existence of the self was the most certain thing in the universe, he kind of said, well, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself and try and find this self, all I ever stumble across is a particular feeling, a particular thought, a particular memory, and so forth. And this is Paul Brock's, a neuropsychologist who I interview in the book. And contemporary neuroscience, pretty much, they all seem to hold something around the bundle view. The people who study how the sense of self emerges through the brain are pretty much in agreement that there is certainly no one spot in the brain where it all comes together, and that also the very nature of subjective experience is much more fragmented than we kind of tell the story of it afterwards. And that we basically do a lot of work tidying up experience to create a coherent sense of self and narrative. And that in experimental conditions, and if you examine people with certain brain pathologies and so forth, it's not difficult to show that actually things are much, much messier than that. It's much more like Hume said, one thing after another, different bits of the brain not knowing what the other's doing, lots of unconscious processes and so forth. So this is a view which has a tremendously rich pedigree. Now the question that emerges from this really is whether or not that means the self is an illusion. Now, Susan Blackmore is a psychologist who likes to use the illusion thing. And she gives a good justification of it. She says an illusion is basically something that is not what it seems to be, or is in some way misleading intellectually or perceptually. So when I say the self is an illusion, that's what I'm saying. And she thinks that's a Buddhist view as well. So here it's kind of a technical definition of illusion. It's an illusion because it's not what it seems to be. But I think when you go around saying self is an illusion, I don't think that's how people generally take it. People take it to mean the self doesn't really exist in some way. And I think that's nonsense for the reasons that go back to the water and all those other things, right? You don't discover that something doesn't exist by discovering that it's just a collection of parts, because everything is just a collection of parts. I think there is one important consequence of this view, which isn't always properly accepted, which is the consequence it has for the idea of identity over time. Because we do, all of us have an idea of self-identity, personal identity, that we are the same person over time. Now, again, I don't want to overstate this. I think part of the problem with this literature on this is it's full of overstatement on both sides, perhaps. But I think, yeah, as Paul Ricoeur said, selfhood is not sameness. What that means is that the problem with the concept of identity is it's very strict. It has very strict logical conditions. Something is or isn't the same thing, right? You know, if I replace this glass with another one, it just isn't the same glass. If it stays here and I don't do anything to it, it is the same. It's a binary thing. But I think the consequence of accepting the view that we are these bundles, these ordered collections of memories, experiences, and so forth, we no longer become we're just not the kind of thing where you can talk about identity in the same way, which is why Derek Parfit says identity is not what matters in survival. Continuing to exist is basically a kind of a process in which the present self is always changing, evolving, developing into something else. And so that's why, I mean, Harold Noonan is a contemporary philosopher who is critical of this kind of view, and he says that the topic of personal identity is strictly speaking non-existent. And that is the preposterous thought that I really want to end on, because I agree with that. I think it's important to recognize that we are not the kind of things that simply popped into existence at birth, continue to exist, the same thing, then die off the cliff edge at the end or go into another realm. We are these very remarkably ordered collections of things. It's because we're so ordered in this collection that we are able to think of ourselves as being singular persons. But there is no singular person there, and that means we're forever changing. And if ever you ask the question, am I the same person as the one I was yesterday, last week, 10 years, years before? There is never a simple factual answer to that. The answer is always, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And the interesting and important thing is to try and think about what those ways are, which one of them really matter, and in a certain extent embrace the fact that there is no permanent abiding essence which is always the same.
When you do introspect, you said things just pop up. But it's also known that people, sort of beginning meditators, they find that what pops up, although it's random and there's no single self that appears, almost everything is self-related. Almost everything is about people we know, things we want to do, memories we've had, random things we're worrying about. And a lot of the Buddhist literature, whatever the actual doctrinal view, is about reducing that self-concern. It's about saying it's not so much theoretically whether there's a self or not. It's about a lot of our suffering is caused because we think too much about the self. So are you actually helping in that process, or are you making it worse?
Well, you know, this is where I kind of part company a bit with the Buddhists. It seems to be assumed that if one discovers that there is no abiding self, again, and the idea of there's an illusion, that somehow it becomes a kind of ethical imperative to loosen sense of self and attachment to self, and that the ideal to be achieved is kind of as far from that as possible. Now, I don't think this follows, because, as I say, I don't think it's true that what we discover is the self doesn't exist. What we discover is something about the nature of the self, which is, and its impermanence, and the fact that it's not as rigid and as solid as we think. Now, I don't see why it follows from discovering that the ultimate objective we should have it should be somehow to dissolve our sense of self as much as possible. There are neurological disorders in which people lose sense of self. You know, there are things you could do to your brain. There's a wonderful story of a woman who became a very well-known spiritual teacher, preaching the importance of loss and ego and all that kind of thing. And it did turn out she had this massive brain tumor, and that was what was causing her loss of self. Now, the fact of the matter was, she achieved through this brain tumor what some people spend decades trying to achieve through meditation. And I wonder, why are they trying to achieve that? Now, you could be trying to achieve that because it's suffering, it's escape from suffering, right? So, you know, maybe this is just a satisfying way to live. If you find this a good way to live, if you find that losing sense of ego, becoming more detached, does make you more compassionate, does make you live better, I'm not going to argue with that as a goal. But when people would try to claim that that is kind of the only goal which is compatible with the proper understanding of our own nature, I don't think that follows. I think a lesser attachment to self follows, but not the desire to minimize as much as possible.
Sure. I mean, my question was premised on really well-being, in a sense, that it's not so much that you try and dissolve or make the self disappear because that's what the realization that the self is not absolute does. It's that the process of decentering, I think the Buddhists actually speak about thinning the ego. They don't speak about eliminating it. And the reason for that is that it helps us connect with other people. It's that the claim is that sort of narcissistic chattering, in which most of us spend 90% of our lives, is actually a barrier to really connecting with each other and a barrier to actually doing social good.
Well, it can be, but again, I don't think that if you actually look at people who have done the most social good, there's no neat correlation between that and how much they have a sense of their own self and identity. And in some ways, you can even say that there's a danger of, paradoxically, the real emphasis on achieving this state can be more narcissistic. I mean, you know, people spending years and years of their lives alone in solitary practice, trying to dissolve the ego. You know, saying, well, yeah, but this is about developing compassion and all that kind of thing. Well, you know, if one wants to be critical, one can say, well, you know, how much are, you know, a bunch of monks in a monastery really helping the world by sitting there clearing their minds? It was interesting a few years ago when we had, you know, the monks come out in Burma in protest, because what was striking about that was precisely that this was unusual. Their normal modus operandi is to renounce the world and go into retreat. It was only because there was such an extreme situation they felt it necessary to come out. So I really, I do take the point up to a point, but you know, it's just not the case that it's the more you do of this, the more you're able to be a compassionate and ethical person.
Sure. The two main predictors of evil, studying people like Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot, were self-esteem and moral idealism. And that these things we think of as good things, that actually, when you combine ego with conviction, you actually do a lot of harm. Once you have this realization, one of the things that follows might be that the process of thinning the ego has social benefit. It's not to say that we retreat from the world, but rather that we more effectively engage with it when we realize that.
Yeah, sure. But I think, again, if you're thinning, it's a matter of degree here, isn't it? And of course, the other thing, of course, you talk about predictors of evil, but another one is extreme ability to switch off empathy or not having empathy in the first place. Empathy is about seeing the things from another person's point of view. It's precisely about recognizing that no matter what you say about bundles and the structure of the self, everyone has a subjective perspective on the world. Everyone experiences the world as an individual who suffers and has pain and so forth. And so again, it's very important to retain the idea that we live in a world of selves, of individuals, in order to have that empathetic compassion, which is important for ethics as well.
Okay. Wait, one word that jumped out at me when I read your book was incertophobia, which is the fear of vagueness. Now, I wanted to ask a bit more about that. It kind of applies to the book and the issue, but I think it applies more generally to popular philosophy and a few other things. In order to talk about these issues, I mean, you cover God, you cover reincarnation, free will, determinism, virtue ethics, various other things. It's impossible to do that in an accessible book without occasionally allowing vagueness to rest. So partly, what's your own view on tolerable levels of vagueness, and what's your own view about, you know, what we should accept in culture as a whole?
I'm really talking there about the fact that there are lots of things in the world where our understanding of them is by necessity not strict. And here I'm just simply following, I'm never tired of repeating the line from Aristotle, which is that it's the mark of the trained mind only to accept as much precision as a subject matter allows. And I think sometimes we want more precision than can be given. Right. There are always sort of different levels of debate. The deeper down you go, the more detail you get and the more specialised you get. It is very important that debates are connected up at the levels at which they do connect. Now, to do that, to be synthetic in that way, you have to take things at a level of generality, which is, from the level of the more specialised discipline, a bit of simplification. Now, there are ways of doing that. I think the knack is obviously to do that without being inaccurate, but, sometimes you have to gloss over. And to me, I'm willing to take the risk, if you like. I'm paying the price of, ranging quite widely and therefore, perhaps tripping up on areas which are not completely my expertise. Because I think if no one does that, then, really all this specialised knowledge is lost to the rest of us. We have to try and see how it fits together.